Okay, I'm going to show you a way real quick here to use Lightwave animation with the Vue backgrounds and sort of render that all in Lightwave. And what we're actually going to use is our Firewalk sample that comes with the Lightwave 8 content, and actually that should be available in your Start menu on the PC, and if not in the Mac, it should be made available possibly on one of the content CDs or just in the programs preloaded. And what I've done is deleted all the objects except FireGirl and HV emitter, and I've also added a little bit of camera motion in here. So if we take a look at our camera, we just added one other key where we just moved the camera around and sort of rotated it down just so we have a little bit more interesting of an animation in there. And what we want to do is sort of integrate this with a Vue background. And we could do this any number of ways. We're just going to show you something real quick, just to kind of get the point across. So we're going to start out by using the Vusynchronize plugin. And if you notice, we only have 60 frames in this animation, so we have to go to our render options and make those adjustments so that we have the same amount of frames. So we'll make sure we have the panel selected, hit escape to close that out, hold down Control Shift right mouse click, go to render options, and what we're going to go ahead and do is change this first frame to 0, hit enter, last frame to 121 and hit enter. And that way we're working with the exact number of frames that we have in Lightwave, so we're working with the same number in Vue. We're going to go back to our Vusynchronize plugin. You can see we have 122 frames, so that's 0 to 121. We want to select our render camera, and also want to make sure our light is selected. Then hit Synchronize Data, click OK, and now we're going to go over to Vue, and we're going to click Yes, and it's going to say our data was retrieved. And now I'm going to open up our timeline, display that, and if we take a look at our animation, you can see that we have our camera moving and what would be tracking our character object. Now what we could also do, if you wanted this to match up correctly as far as proportion-wise, we could create sort of a box and kind of flip back and forth between Lightwave and Vue and kind of take a look at the sizing, and you could just make a box the size of that character and kind of move it along back and forth just to match up the animation, just so you can keep in mind the proportions. You of course wouldn't want to keep that box object in the scene, or even you could just use a sphere as the head of that character and just kind of do a little bit of motion animation with that. And if you really want to be very precise, you could actually take a point light and then parent that light to one of the character bones, and then kind of track that motion and export that in here and apply that to an object. But it's really not necessary, just because we can kind of eyeball as far as most of our proportion. So we really don't need to worry about that too much. One thing we want to make sure is we have a good texture on our ground plane. So we're going to go ahead and actually load in the complex rock from rocks and click OK. And that'll give us a nice texture on the ground. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out real quick just so we can see a larger preview of that. And it's not actually we're going to go ahead and change that to maybe a grass texture, make it look a little bit different. So we can go to Landscapes and select Grass and click OK. And now we can see we have a nice grass texture on the ground. And we just want to do this really quick, so we're just going to add something in the background here. Go ahead and add a terrain. Doesn't have to be anything special. Make sure we bring it down a little bit below the ground plane so we have a little bit of blending once we apply that grass texture to this terrain. I'm going to zoom out a little and kind of position our viewports so we can see that terrain in the background. Make it a little bigger so it's not extremely small, because we might kind of want a mountain out of it. We can make it even bigger if we wanted. Just doesn't have to be huge, and it's far enough away that we won't have to worry about any shadows of the character casting onto that specific object. I want to go and select that grass texture for that terrain now, so we have a nice blend in between the two. We'll go ahead and render that, and now you can see we have a nice blend mode in there. So now we have a background, and we can actually use this background to render an animation sequence where we can have the character walking through the ground but we do need to worry about the shadows, so there is a little bit of modeling we're going to have to do in Lightwave, but this is pretty much our basics right now. And this is just so we can use the Vue atmosphere and the sky and not have to worry about rendering a very large spherical map for the sky. And if we want it animated, we don't have to worry about that either. And what we also don't have to do is export our terrains and entire scene into Lightwave and kind of position those, because that can be a problem considering we're creating the animation in Lightwave and everything won't be exactly synced up, and our terrains scales won't be perfect either. So we could actually go ahead too and make another terrain if we wanted, just to fill in some of this other area in the backdrop. So now when we move across, we have another terrain, and it doesn't have to be huge. I'm just kind of generating a simple composite here, just to kind of show you the principles of integrating these two together. And we can see we have a nice blend. What we could also do is add ecosystem to these mountains, which is pretty much probably what you'll want to be doing, considering that otherwise you could just do this stuff in Lightwave, and Vue really has no purpose unless you're, of course, using the atmospheric rendering and all that. What we want to make sure too is that our sunlight is properly positioned. So we're going to grab our sun, make sure point at camera is off, and we have to select its motion as synchronized and with the light. And as you can see, that already made a drastic effect on our scene as far as lighting. So we just want to make sure that those are matching up correctly in both of our programs, and that way we don't have to worry about any incorrect lighting. Okay, so that should be good. What I'm going to go ahead and do is go back to frame 0, and I want to render a frame at frame 0. What we could also do is change your skies and things like that, set up your whole scene, but you want to make sure that everything is synchronized with that light, because once you load in one of the presets, so if we load in an atmosphere, and let's say we want to change it up a bit, we would have to go back and make sure that we synchronize that light back up with this other light from Lightwave, and that way we get our sun in the correct position. What you also have to keep in mind too is that it might change your lighting color, so you have to make those adjustments in Lightwave as well. But we're going to go ahead and right mouse click on this camera up here, set this to final render, render to screen, 640 by 480 will be fine, and we're just going to go ahead and render that. And as you can see, it's a very simple scene. We have a little bit of graininess in here from that texture specifically, but this will still give you an idea of how exactly to blend these two together. So we're going to go ahead and save this by clicking the little disk right here, and then go ahead and load that into the image editor in Lightwave. And now that we have it loaded into the image editor, take a look at it, and what we have to go ahead and do is set this as a background. So if you Control F7, it's going to bring up our compositing in the effects panel. We can select our background image as that render we just made in Vue. I mean, we're at frame 0 right now, so any other part of the animation is not going to show up rendered correctly, because we still have to render our sequence in Vue, our 122 frame sequence, which is going to match up in the background, which will go throughout the course of the animation. But I'm going to go ahead and render this right now and just show you how it looks with her in the scene. And as you can see, we've nice blending. The shadows match up where they should. We have a little bit too much ambient light in the Vue scene, so we can go ahead and adjust that, or adjust the ambient light in Lightwave. So those things you do have to match up, especially your global illumination in both programs. But as you can see, there is no shadow for this girl as she's walking on this ground plane. So what we actually need to do is create our own ground plane in Lightwave and kind of load that in. So we'll go to Modeler, and we just need to create a single-sided polygon. So we're going to grab the box tool, and we want to kind of zoom out kind of far, just so we can get a good size on that and make sure it's big enough to cover most parts of the scene. Go to the polygon mode and make sure the guide is pointing upward, and that way we know the polygon is facing the correct direction. What we also want to do is grab the points and hit V on the keyboard for set value, and click Y, and OK, and this will set it exactly on the 0, so we know we're on the direct ground, the grid, pretty much where her feet are animated. And hit Q on the keyboard, and we're just going to call this ground. And now we want to go ahead and save this and export it into Lightwave, or into layout, sorry. Okay, we have our ground plane in here now, and if we go through our animation, we can actually see that her feet are moving slightly through this ground plane. So she's not exactly perfect on the grid. I'm going to go ahead and pull that down just a little so that the feet are not going through. And now we need to set up texturing, front image mapping on this ground plane, because if we were to render it right now, we would pretty much just see that ground plane overlapping the rest of the scene. So we're going to our surface editor and select the ground and make sure we have an image map, set that projection to front, grab that animation background that we have, which will actually be a sequence once we have rendered it. I'm going to turn off pixel blending and click use texture. Now if we go ahead and render this, you'll be able to see that we have this dark line where you can actually see our terrain. So we're going to need to balance that out. But first I want to show you the effect of the shadows. So we need to go back to our render options. So Control Shift right mouse click and go to render options. And if you don't have a right mouse button or a Mac user, you can hold down the Apple key and click, and that will also give you the right mouse button. Now what we need to do is turn on Ray Trace Shadows. I'm just going to turn off Extra Ray Traced Optimization right now because we're not going to need it. And I'm going to close that out, and now we can re-render that frame. And now we can see that we have our shadow on the ground, but we also need to take care of the rest of the stuff that's going on in here. The easiest way to take care of that is to change our luminosity to 50% and our diffusion to 50%. And now if we go ahead and render that, we should see a nice balance. But we don't. It's a little dark. I'm going to go ahead. That's because our luminosity, because we didn't hit enter, went to 0. So always make sure you hit enter after doing any of these manual controls for percentages and amounts within Lightwave. In Vue, that doesn't matter. Whatever you enter in, when you push enter, it'll close the panel, but in Lightwave it is different. So we're going to render the frame now. And we still have a little bit of a seam on there. So what we could actually do is take in our plane a bit. And mainly the reason for that is what we could do is if we increased our luminosity to 100% and our diffusion to 0, which is usually what we do in a case like this, and we went ahead and rendered that, it would blend perfectly. But the problem is there's no shadow, and we do get a little bit of distortion on the edge over here. So we still need to set it back to 50 and then 50 again so we get our shadow. But what we're going to need to do in this case, and it's not always like this, it really depends on the type of scene you have, is we need to do a little bit of object dissolve, and that's just so we get rid of that last line and back there. So we're going to open up object properties for that ground plane. We're going to go to render and select distant dissolve, and we want to change our max distance to about 20 meters for this specific object. We want to turn off self shadows, turn off cast shadows. We just want to have receive shadows on. And now if we go ahead and render that, we should see a big difference. As you can see now, take a look, that background is gone, that back line we had, and we still have our shadow in here. So we can go ahead and actually, if we wanted to adjust that darkness of that shadow, you could, even with our changes here, we could go to our surface editor and go back to 0 luminosity and 100% diffusion, since we have a fade on there now. So if we render that frame, take a look, go to continue, and now you can see the differences. And the difference is mainly that when you're using 100% diffusion, you're going to get this darker bit in the plane. But if we go back, it's what it will actually look like, and all you have to do is go to your lighting options and just adjust your shadow darkness or even your ambient lighting, and that'll take care of any shadow options you have right here. So what we also need to make sure we're doing is, like I said, just keeping this as on a flat plane for this specific motion, and having her move through a terrain where actually moving on top of objects, it's going to be a lot more difficult to set up, and actually something like that you would have to start out in Vue with and create a scene in Vue and then export that into Lightwave. Of course, the problems there is your proportions. because your character will not be completely proportioned with your terrains, and sometimes it's easier to do it this way, but it really depends on the shot you're creating. What we could also do is go ahead and export a tree from Vue and load that in, because when we're using a foreground image, in this case, we won't have our movement, and we could do an image sequence of that foreground with the alpha, but the problem is, if we wanted her to walk under a tree right now, we would need shadows to be casted upon her, because if you look at where the light is, it's pretty much directly on her, from almost from the camera, directly at her, but a little bit of tilt down. So we would need the shadow cast upon her from that tree. So the best way to really do that is just to import trees in. So anything she would really be interacting with, where you'll have shadows or her casting shadows on something, besides really the ground, you're going to want to load in and export from Vue into Lightwave those objects. So if you wanted grass and things like that, you would actually have to go ahead and probably export those into Lightwave so that you can have her walking through grass and things like that. And it can be a little tricky to kind of match those up, but in this case we're kind of keeping the path clear. Or another thing you can do is just kind of have the camera facing upward. And if you've seen any of the promotional videos for some of the integration, if you've seen the mechbot that they've had, kind of getting up and walking through the scene, what they've actually done with that was taken the camera and rotated that upward, and so you can't really see the ground plane, and then you really don't have to worry about shadows on anything, and there wasn't really anything very close to that object. So we pretty much had the same thing where we had they had the mechbot walking through, and then they added a few imported bushes, or of course you could also use those foreground images, but of course the shadows won't match up then, so you need to make sure that maybe you'll import that in for those specific things. Okay, another thing we need to take a look at is actually rendering our sequence for our background, because right now we just have one frame. If we rendered it, this animation, we would just have one frame throughout. If we go to frame 70 and take a look and render a frame, you're going to see that it's still the exact same background that we had before. So we're of course needing to make a change to that. We're going to need to render an animation sequence. So we need to switch over to Vue, and we want to go to Animation and Render Animation. Now we want to render our sequence from frame 0 to 121, and a frame increment of 1. We also want to make sure we set up all of our rendering options, and it's best to get it right the first time, because otherwise we're going to have to go back and re-render the whole sequence, and depending on how long the sequence is, it could be time consuming. Another thing we want to keep in mind is whether or not you want to render it as an animation or an image sequence. I would suggest image sequence, because that way you get the full amount of quality and you don't need to worry about compression, especially if we do it as bitmaps. So if we go to Browse right now and we save this as a bitmap, it will save an image sequence. We can just keep that called Untitled and click Save. 16 million colors, OK. And if you want to change that, you can go back to Format Options, and you can change that to 256, and there's also other things you can make adjustments at. And then when you're ready to render, you can just click Render Animation, and what that's going to go ahead and do is, since it's just called Untitled right now, it's going to render it as Untitled underscore 0001, and then frame 2 is going to be 0002, and so on all the way to 000121, or 00121 it would actually be. And what we can also do here is render an alpha. And now this is if we were doing a foreground image where it's not going to be casting shadows on anything, and we can actually go ahead and render that foreground as well, doing the same method where we can click Browse and save that as Untitled underscore A, and select which type of image file we want. Bitmap's probably the best, because bitmaps are not compressed. Of course, you only get a certain bit depth with them, but it's usually acceptable and good enough for just about anything, even film. So when you're ready to render that, you just go ahead and click Render Animation, and it'll create all those images for the image sequence, and then you can just go ahead and load those in to Lightwave and set them as the background. And I'm just going to go ahead and render what we have set right now, just at frame 70, just to kind of show you how it will match up once that's actually done. So we just go ahead and render frame 70 right now, and then go ahead and take a look at see what happens. And we can see our render right now. Actually, if we take a look, we can see this line, and that's because our terrain is actually above the ground plane. So you could go ahead and fix that. Of course, you have to re-render everything. So you just want to make sure everything's perfect first. We do a few test renders, take a look around. Of course, you'll probably have a lot better looking scene than I have right now, because this really looks kind of terrible. But it gives you an idea of kind of what's going on. We're going to go ahead and save this, and then load that into Lightwave. Alright, we have that all loaded in right now. We're going to go ahead and render the frame, and see how it matches up in Lightwave as she's walking across this terrain. And we can already see the shadows down here. And we're going to click continue and take a look, and now we can see her shadow is going across here. And if we had this as an animation sequence, of course we just have it at frame 70 for both of them. But if you go ahead and render the animation sequence, then you can have her walking through this environment. And like I said, you could have your ecosystems in there, which is really the main point of all this, is being able to use your ecosystems, because of course with these terrains you could of course just export them into Lightwave with color maps, and it really wouldn't be a big deal. But you can take advantage this way of, like I said, the ecosystems from Vue, but still be able to use your character animation, hypervoxels, things like that. Even the atmospheric effects that we have in Vue. Of course, if you're using fog or haze, you might have to match up your scene in Lightwave to sort of make those blend together. But overall, you'll be able to use a lot more features if you're using compositing, as opposed to importing and exporting certain things. And you just got to learn to kind of deal with certain aspects of it. Of course, like I said, we have right now we have on this ground plane that we kind of created is our dissolve, our distant dissolve, which is dissolving from about this point on, which gives us a nice blend. But of course, if you're using a bigger scene, you might want to change that a little, and that's really based on the camera anyway. So that if we have it set at 20 meters, it's 20 meters from the camera, and then it'll dissolve out from there. So it's solid up to 20 meters and then fades out. So that really depends on where the camera is, and you just got to kind of play around with it. Maybe make some envelopes for it, and just kind of see what makes the best effect. Because it can be kind of hard to blend together some of those shadows with certain compositing, especially if you're looking at the ground. And like I said, with some of the promotional shots that you might have seen with the mechbot, they were actually looking up into the sky, and you couldn't see the ground, so you didn't really have to worry about a lot of the shadows blending together. And now we've pretty much gone through all of the integration options that you have between Vue and Lightwave. So I hope you learned a lot, and you can really start using the two programs together and start making some really amazing scenes using Lightwave's special effects features that you can't use in Vue. That's character animation and all the good things that come from Lightwave, and then all the good things that come from Vue.